Thank you for joining us for another episode of Channel Revelations. We'll be together for the next couple of hours discussing some interesting topics with the guides. I'm Ethan Fox, and I'm here with Micheila Sheldan. Micheila's a trance channel, so she'll be in a trance state throughout this whole episode that we're doing today. And but I don't discuss any of the questions with her beforehand, just because I like to make sure that her conscious mind doesn't in any way filter the information or interfere with it in any way. So let's just get started whenever you're ready. Okay, so I'd like to start with the Council of Light and anybody else who needs to be here, but because I want to touch on some topics we discussed last time. And there were some interesting subjects that we talked about. For example, we talked about the whole Mars agenda and the different things connected to that. And there were a lot of things that you shared that I didn't even know personally. For example, you mentioned the various cities around the world, like the Line City in the UAE, which is being developed to house millions of people in a very narrow line that stretches for I don't remember how many miles, but and you mentioned that these different projects like that, were preparing humanity to move off planet and to so that the elites or the human hybrids could have the planet to themselves, have Earth to themselves. Meanwhile, moving people to Mars in a much harsher environment. What I found interesting was I actually looked up the website for the line, and I found that that they have several videos there, and they have multiple cities that they're planning. And there actually is video, actual CGI and actual footage video they made as a commercial advertising each place, where they actually showed a military Mars rover type of vehicle. And the other interesting thing is these cities, this particular line is set in the middle of the desert, which is very much looks like a Mars environment. So it actually does look like they are preparing humanity to get used to living in a confined space and in a harsh environment. On all the other cities that they had planned were all in harsh, remote environments that looked very much like they were set in the middle of Mars with a very desolate environment. And so I was really fascinated to find that actual validation. And now from that context, all of these other projects like Elon Musk's various projects like the Hyperloop and the brain chips and the SpaceX program all kind of make sense and fit in together. And even the various ESG programs perhaps may be linked to that. So I guess my question to start out with is, do you have any more to add to that we might have missed last time that would help us to put these things in perspective?
Well, it is important to note, and we know we've made this point in previous transmissions, is that it is not just a reflection of one activity and one timeline that you are experiencing, because there have been times throughout your history, as well as on the history of other planets, where similar types of activities have taken place. So those that are carrying out these various roles, they are often, we know, motivated by various ego-driven intentions, while at the same time playing out roles that we believe are very important in the evolution of consciousness. So while we know it is comforting to look at these scenarios from the ground level, we always like to add in that they are a part of the combined story of the human collective's divine plan. In many respects, you are all orchestrating a part of this story. It does not necessarily mean that the story has the same ending. So that is what is most important to keep in mind.
These human hybrids, I assume they're hybrid reptilian, or is it some other hybrid?
In many cases, yes. And if we go back to the history that we have explained in our past transmission, we were very focused on a cataclysmic event that took place that brought reptilians to planet Earth. But they are not the only malevolent group of beings that have influence in the way of what you're experiencing. And we want to always caveat this by saying we don't see the reptilian race as a malevolent force. And in fact, very much like humanity, there are a spectrum of beings and varying consciousness and intentions. Many reptilians still exist in harmony on other planets, but the ones who are here have taken on a certain likeness and characteristic to human bodies, and those you would recognize as no different than yourselves. Yet at the same time, there are aspects of what you're asking us that are hard to clarify in a one answer response, because we see influence from many other malevolent forces beyond the earth as well. And it is not to say it is only one. When we refer to reptilians, what we most want to explain is that the inability to feel empathy or emotion around decisions that are unnatural to the human spirit becomes the forefront in terms of these genetic changes, meaning those that are playing out these roles are doing so in a very mind-driven way, where the manifestations that they are attempting to create are not coming from any resonant connection to other human beings, nor do they have the capability to allow the mind to work in concert with an entire sensory suite of other components of their structure. So our simple answer is yes, we see this as the majority of the influence, but there are other influences as well.
Okay, so these individuals that are human reptilian hybrid or whatever other collective you're referring to earlier, are the ones that are at the forefront, let's say Bill Gates or Klaus Schwab or Bill Clinton or one of those individuals, are they conscious of their hybrid nature, or are just they just carry on as if they're regular human beings?
The interesting thing to consider is that they are conscious of their reptilian nature, but are not defining it in the same way that you are. In other words, it is like a level of stature or a specific lineage that has been present on planet Earth for a very long time that is powerful and to be revered, as opposed to something that is oriented to destruction or causing harm on the planet today. So the awareness varies in different humans at different levels of activity. And you've named a few people that we'll comment on as an example. Those that you've brought to our attention have come up in families where at a very young age they have been taught certain things about themselves to hold a specific egoic stance, meaning what they are here to do is a continuation of what others have done before them and must be continued out through the entirety of their incarnation. And they look at this as a mission with great reverence, we should add. So it isn't the same mindset in those that are perhaps involved in very unconscious ways. And there are many on planet Earth today who would revere their government just as much as those in government revere their families and these various lineages. It does not mean that they have a malevolent intent or even understand that they're participating with something this detrimental, we'll say, to the entire planet. So to have a group of beings with this much power and influence, it actually is facilitated by many others at varying levels of consciousness and awareness, that they are becoming more like them in choosing to be their support system.
In more ancient times, there was a movement called Stoicism, and it was popularized by a lot of people in ancient Rome and so on. And today, I find that a lot of these world leaders are very promotional of the idea. In fact, it's a book that they've all read books in this topic. And Stoicism really has to do with, or at least in principle, it seems like the absence of emotion, although they tend to teach it more like managing your emotions. Is Stoicism part of that reptilian consciousness that is absent of emotion?
It is a reflection of it, certainly. So if we look at this one teaching, what we are seeing is navigating an entire collective away from a part of them that would override reptilian influence. Because in order to feel, you are going to have a reaction to that feeling and then attempt to somehow use it as an agent of creation. So if we have a great number of souls who are focused only through the mind and not through the heart or through the emotional body, they are going to want others to receive them in that way as well. Because in that way, they're building an army of, or a network of those who would be in servitude to them. This is how ultimately all of those that are doing things so massively on planet Earth are able to continue on, because there has to be not only acceptance of what is happening, but also a feeling of support or contribution by those who are not involved at all. And this has gone on for decades. So we certainly see this as a teaching and a program used in multiple ways. How you're explaining it and how you're seeing it playing out on planet Earth today, we think is more of a program to manipulate humanity. But those who use it exclusively on an internal basis, those that are perhaps, we could say, in the know, are strengthening a genetic predisposition or potential to create through the mind, which is a very powerful part of your creative potential. So we want to add some detail here that we think is very important about how reptilians actually create and how that's so different from how humans were designed. So if we go back to the very beginning in the origins of Earth, Gaia as a consciousness was calling out to other star systems and beings to support her in her desires and in her endeavors to have a race of beings that she could call her own. And many, many came, not only reptilians, but those of all races throughout the cosmos, to seed a multi-dimensional genetic within this new race. So you contain, each of you as a human being, contain a part of that reptilian DNA. And left to its own to evolve and become something stronger than it was meant to, it would focus you only in the mind, because reptilians, by their very design, are shapeshifters. They have the visionary potential without any connection to empathy or emotion to create in very efficient ways. And they've evolved in this direction. Yet today, what we notice is there is a movement to activate that part of humans and to take humanity out of its original divine blueprint, using all parts of itself. And even teachings, we might say, spiritually and otherwise, that are focusing humans on thoughts. Now, this isn't necessarily wrong, so we want to make sure we're very clear here. The mind is a powerful part of your entire structure, but left to its own and put in a higher place, than the rest of your creative capabilities, it can become very destructive. And that's what you're seeing here is a part of your genetic, a reptilian genetic predisposition being strengthened to the degree that it becomes dominant. And that was never meant to be the case. So, in those who know they are doing it, they are using it to their advantage. For those who are unaware, they are weakened by the result of those efforts and become less able to discern, we believe, but especially lose an innate part of their soul's essence. Because if you are not running thought through emotion, you'll never know how to use your intuition as a guide. We see emotion as a very valuable frequency in how you're here to create. And if it's led astray from reality, meaning you are asked to not feel about what's happening in front of you in each moment and only focus on what's possible in the future, you've truly lost touch of where creation takes place. And further, we could explain that this is somewhat moving humans out of a quantum reality. And when we speak of quantum, we're talking about the present moment in which all possibilities exist. Because the second you step out of that quantum space, you are now working with conditions. And those conditions will weaken your creative potential.
With all the power and resources and money that these individuals have, and if they have a reptilian hybrid genetic, why is it with all their efforts, at least to my awareness, and I could be wrong, at least in the public information that we have, they don't seem to live any lifespans that are significantly longer than regular human beings? I mean, some of them do manage to push into the hundreds or early hundreds or late centenarians, but they don't tend to live that much longer, which is not substantially more than regular humans. Why is that the case?
Ultimately, we believe this is because they are running energy in very destructive and wasteful ways. Because if you are focused only on self and the accumulation of resources for the self, and you're running that energy primarily through the mind and even focused on activities like ceremony and sacred circles that require a soul to raise its energy for a specific outcome, it's a very wasteful type of living on a planet where constant rejuvenation is possible. So it's not to say that some of these individuals are not privy to some of the more advanced technologies and opportunities that have come to the planet to rejuvenate themselves. But even in using these, there's still a weakened vibrational manifestation of a human. When we use the term hybrid, we want to explain there are two different types of hybrids that we notice. The true hybrid within you is a pure manifestation of your DNA. And this is possible for every human being today. If you were seated in the likeness of all races, then you are a genetic melting pot of all cosmic souls. And the possibility for you to rise to the occasion of that genetic truly exists. But to come here and only focus on a small subset of that DNA or a very limited part of your genetic predisposition is always going to end up in a hybrid being who cannot realize their true power. And otherwise, you can hybridize towards a more expansive manifestation of who you are able to become, or you could hybridize away from your power place and from where you're able to create. And we might say we see that hybridizing away taking place across the board because many of you realize you have been taught that there are only 3 strands of DNA and the rest is junk. This is a reflection of what's actually going on deep within you because the more that you believe you are not free to explore all of the cosmic aspects of yourself, the less you will be working in the more energetic and powerful areas of your structure. So this is why we believe you're noticing what you do, to utilize that very narrow scope of creative potential is going to drain a great deal of energy.
You mentioned ceremonies and other kinds of practices that they're doing that are draining their energy. Now, are you referring to what we discussed in a previous conversation about these secret Kabbalistic teachings that they're using?
We are, yes, that is one version of what we are speaking of, absolutely. But more so, it is not the ceremony necessarily. The ceremony is perhaps something that's been cultivated around the flow of energy. And we want to give you a very grounded example before we explain it in a more collective state. Many of you have been taught to focus on something that you want or need. And in raising your energy and focusing on that thing, you are attempting to manifest it into being. And while it can certainly happen this way because you do have the ability to focus on something energetically and receive it, it isn't the most conducive way to run energy. You have the potential within you to activate all that you are meant to receive from source. And this takes a more expansive type of focus or viewpoint than that one thing that you need, whether it's a relationship or a car or money. We see many humans on planet Earth today using techniques to receive these things. But if you are all connected and one is running energy in a certain direction of their needs, there is going to somehow end up being an imbalance somewhere else in the collective or in the universe. And this isn't often taught. It's not because you're ultimately taking away the inheritance of another soul, but you're creating hierarchical vibrations when you are doing this, unbeknownst to yourself. So when we see a collective in a ceremony, for example, focused on an intent that is malevolent, what's actually going on is an imbalance is beginning to take fashion and shape within them. And that's why these souls aren't actually living the easy lives that you believe. We know looking from afar, it may seem they have the money and the power and the glamour of lives that many of you would desire. But it is not easy to hold up that much energy and intention and constantly focus on it as a member of a collective that is moving the earth in the wrong direction. Because ultimately, what you're going to find is something within yourself is going to become imbalanced. It's as if you were to imagine your soul moving from earth into the heavens, and you might believe in sin. And as you receive the welcome of many angels, have to account for that sin in some way and ask for forgiveness of a God. And that isn't necessarily the process. The universe is always rebalancing energy. It takes place within us, it takes place within collectives, it takes place upon the earth, and it takes place within every dimension. So justice is not something that anyone is able to place upon someone else. We know this is an idea that may be difficult for some to accept because you believe humans are doing wrong, and when they do wrong, they should be brought to justice. But justice is an organic state of every human being as they move through the cosmos. So if something is being done to siphon resources from others, or attention and energy is going out on a malevolent focus, something within the life of that human being or within the group is going to come out of balance. And that is how justice actually takes place. So we do see some suffering going on within these individuals, which we know would surprise many today because as an outsider looking in, it would seem this is not the case.
And what is the significance of children being involved in this? Because especially in recent years, we've been hearing a lot about young children being involved in these things, and nowadays there is a lot of sexual types of information being brought into schools for young children and so on. It seems very inappropriate for children that age. So there appears to be something there. Is this part of those secret Kabbalistic teachings?
Well, unfortunately, much of this goes back to ancient times when there were sacrifices of animals or even children of those in prominent positions to certain gods. These themes continue to play out and have been a part of the teachings that we have spoken about. It is as if this offering is going to bring a sense of power or more resource or support from realms beyond the earth. But this sexuality piece is also coming, we'd say, from these beliefs that energy is power, because sexual energy, while we know it is prioritized in physical bodies and on the physical earth, is actually not the premise of creation. It is life force that is rising throughout the chakras that brings this orgasmic and blissful state, allowing you to manifest. But much of this life force rising has been changed and degraded in order to move it in a certain direction in an accelerated fashion. So those who believe that life force is sexual energy in a very deliberate fashion are carrying out these deviant acts and perhaps making them very commonplace because it has an element of giving up your power. So when sexuality is channeled in the lower chakras, which we've spoken of in a previous transmission, it's very wasted. But energy always goes somewhere. So if a human soul isn't using that energy in a positive or impactful way, it will be claimed by someone else. So when you're using tantric practice, for example, in a sacred coupling situation, that energy is maintained within the combined auric field of the two who are agreeing to raise it. And in so doing, the divine plans of both of those individuals become raised in their potential. And this is very well known. This can be seen in so many of your ancient cultures on Earth and even beyond in various star systems. But if you take that premise of Tantra and you make it something physical, you lose the connection between the soul that is doing it and the one that they are doing it with. And that energy can be siphoned and claimed. It is hard for us to explain how this happens, but imagine a ceremony being somewhat like a magnet, even creating a portal. This is what many of those who are involved in these ceremonies believe, is that through sacrifice or through sexual activity, energy is being created that is going to become a siphon or a draw as much as a focus for what is desired. Because those that are using these tools understand that if they put into the collective ideas or beliefs about sexuality not being sacred or revered or important, that energy will become so tangible that they will be able to use it as an agent and tool of their success, while at the same time weakening physical bodies, weakening the potential of every soul's divine plan, and truly changing the genetic potential as well, because your crystalline DNA, it relies upon these very sentient and telepathic unions, we believe, which have been degraded by these human hybrids you're speaking of.
you mentioned numerous times that these reptilian hybrid beings uh, originally came to Earth because they destroyed their own planet. It seems to me that what they're basically destroying the Earth as well. So they're doing the same thing they did on their own planet. So even if they manage to get human beings off of Earth and onto Mars and keep Earth to themselves, meanwhile they're destroying Earth anyway. So they're going to end up right where they started.
Well, what you must keep in mind is that a reptilian does not live well in the same environment that humans do. And we want to introduce the concept of density, which we know is a word that is defined in spiritual circles very differently. And it should be, because there are different manifestations of density for different purpose. To us, density does not have to be negative, even though it can be. Density is a slower speed of vibration in which material focus becomes the norm. So the more that we are working in a dense environment, the more we are apt to be focused in material and a slower speed of vibration, but especially to use the mind as a construct of creation, because there is no reason to utilize intuition or plasma or have some type of channeled connection if all you are focused on is material. And many of the reptilians who have come from their various star systems are used to working in denser environments. These are not necessarily negative environments, but they're conducive to the way that they create. So even though reptilians shapeshift and they create through the mind, they are apt to use a more dense energy and vibration to do this in an accelerated fashion, which we know seems illogical, but we want you to remember that on a reptilian star system, there's been a great deal of evolution and change, and energies have shifted. And this is why we believe you're seeing some of the activities play out. You believe that many of these beings are destroying the earth, but what they're attempting to create is a level of density such that their ability to create becomes more enhanced, in other words, and yours becomes less enhanced. It's not to say that humans aren't meant to have a material experience, but it doesn't have to be masked by density. So sometimes it's important to experience the vibrational understanding of density versus the material one. And many of you are aware of what we are speaking. You can step out of body and you can sense the energies in a particular room or within another human. And you can tell right away if those energies are vibrating similar to you, if they feel heavy or dense. And this is one of the ways that density manifests as well. It can be held in the energy field. Reptilians don't hold density in their energy fields. They like to exist in environments where density accelerates their creative process. So if you carry a great deal of density as humans and you're existing in denser environments, it's going to weaken your creative potential and spirit while accelerating that of another. And we want to also explain that sometimes what evolved races have learned is that the best way to upgrade a reality is to somehow self-destruct what it was before. Not that this is the right decision for every race and every collective in every circumstance. But if you are a master manifester, and you know you have the ability to change realities very quickly, it would be easier for you to destroy what exists in the now, especially if it's a material existence, and change it from that now into what you believe it should be. So we think that's a part of the process as well. It isn't that these people will necessarily have a difficult time because they have more resources and knowledge at their disposal. In fact, they are using very insightful grid keepers and Akashic record readers to navigate the changes on the earth. Ancient tribes, for example, always had their oracle or the gatekeeper and grid worker that understood the relationship of what was changing within the earth and could help them to nomadically move between one location and another for the benefit of the whole. And we see this as a part of perhaps the orchestration of what's going on. That is why the entire earth is not being focused on at once, but key areas perhaps are being focused on one at a time.
So are you saying that, for example, genetically modified foods and the chemtrails they're spraying, the various frequencies like 5G, and so on, all the toxins in our environment through so many different avenues, are all of these, obviously there are many different things going on. The companies are making money, and maybe there's an agenda also to harm the health of humanity and to reduce our, as you mentioned, our ability to function optimally. But are all of these also being done to create a denser environment so that the reptilians can thrive? Meanwhile, humans are suppressed.
They are all done a bit differently and for a different purpose. So, the one very important manifestation we want to speak to is geoengineering, because certainly this is a parallel to what we are speaking to in terms of a dense environment. You may believe that toxins are being sprayed in the air simply to erode human health. And there are some who have that intention or agenda, but from a very high level influence, what's happening is creating a field. And that field is a dense vibration of energy. So it has dual effect. It is going to lower consciousness, but it is also going to make it easier for those who are quote unquote in power or wanting to change the earth in the direction of their desires, access to things that humans have no idea they are actually taking advantage of. But if we look at the food, for example, we have alluded to the idea that you are in the midst of a genetic war. And that genetic warfare is coming back from experiences that you've had both on Earth as well as in other star systems. While certainly the toxins in food are a density and will create density in the body, they're not necessarily having the same effect on the planet unless you look at the physicality of the soil. And we believe physicality is a part of this conversation because if the physical earth and physical bodies are brought into a more dense and lower vibration, the energy that's used to create is far less available. Not because it's not there, but because it isn't humans' first choice of how to change what's happening to them in opposition of their desires. We see so many today who struggle, for example, with physical pain or disease. And while the energy field could have a huge impact on that reality, there are steps taken that are matching the physical nature of the disease or of the pain. And we think that is a huge part of what's taking place here is somewhat keeping humans in a vicious cycle of physicality and only focused on physicality, while those that are using these various ceremonies and techniques strengthen their non-physical and vibrational power. It is the same with the water. But these beings, many of them, we're speaking of the reptilian human hybrids, they also have a different detoxification potential than you do. And it's not to say that it's working on all of them. So keep in mind, there's a belief about status and a certain lineage that puts them above and beyond human beings. But what many of them do not realize is that whether they like it or not, they are becoming more human and you are becoming more reptilian. So both parties are genetically changing each other due to close proximity. And that means that there are very highly plasmic detoxification protocols that their ancient ancestors and elders could tap into aren't necessarily working as well as they believe they are on planet Earth. And we think some of them are coming to this realization, which is why there's been an acceleration of this timeline. In other words, if they aren't able to sustain and maintain their more quote unquote believed to be enlightened state of being, things must move in the direction of their desires quicker to sustain their life on planet Earth.
Is this the 2030 various agendas like Build Back Better or the World Economic Forum's plan, or is it a much longer time frame?
No, this is exactly what we're referring to, and we believe that many of you are noticing this. It's becoming very accelerated, and that acceleration is due to a perhaps sense of we loosely use the term defeat, not to say they believe that they are not creating what they desire, but they're feeling within themselves that the clock is ticking because what they are doing is, to answer your question, inevitably going to have an effect on their bodies despite who they believe themselves to be.
So at 2030, they've assessed that they have to draw the line because afterwards, these adverse things like geoengineering are affecting them beyond what they can control.
Well, there are many considerations, and certainly that is one. Keep in mind that these groups of human hybrids are working with oracles, for example, astrologers, for example, those that have the ability to reach out into the future and predict certain models. And that's what the timing of many of these events has been based upon. But also, there is a constant observation of how much energy humans are tapping into and how much of their creative power they have accessed and how much sovereignty is actually coming to the surface. And that is also putting them on a timeline trajectory where they believe that they're going to have to do something in a much more accelerated fashion than what they first imagined. Because inevitably, the more that humanity awakens and begins to feel through their emotional bodies the sadness and the anger of all that has taken place that they have not realized, the less they will be willing to agree. And that agreement is needed. That agreement is needed energetically, it's needed physically. And if it is not received, then those that are here will not be able to transition.
Now, from my perspective, and I could be incorrect in this assumption, and we've discussed this topic before, in that based on the cycles, I think after 2030, 2033, things should start to improve a little bit. But as we discussed before, just because the cycles don't support certain containers of experience doesn't mean that the people in the world who are trying to do those things will stop doing it. They may pull back a little bit because they can't succeed as much. But obviously, if they're using oracles and channels and astrologers just like we are, they must also see that potential. So why bother pushing so hard if there's a pretty good chance they're going to fail?
Because they have seen these potentials before and they have changed the way in which they do things. So, what you are asking us is something we agree with, meaning there can still be activities that continue on if there is a knowing that the astrological influences are going to shift, as long as you also shift the way the activities are being manifested. In many respects, we have seen this in so many different timelines where humans have assumed that it is a more enlightened period, but deep beneath the surface, things were happening in preparation for a turn of events. Now, we don't say this to dishearten humans who are listening to this broadcast today, because you are far different beings than you were in so many of these past experiences. Historically, what we have noticed is when these periods of turbulence and chaos take place, great rises in consciousness are possible. But that doesn't always mean that consciousness is going to override the influence of those who understand where it is heading. So humans need to understand that personal choice and how they live their lives at the ground level is going to be just as important, if not more, than working the energetic or spiritual considerations of what they now perceive. Because ultimately, what you are going for is a balance of both. The density that has been created here is a very thick film. Energetically, it is, and physically, it is manifested in different belief systems and activities and body types, and defaulting to things even in your DNA, karmically and otherwise, that need not be repeated. But we have hope, because what we see is many have stopped in their tracks to observe what is happening through a higher perspective and are calculating living completely different lives than what they have done before. And we're talking about very massive and radical shifts in lifestyle. And this is, if this is being calculated and considered and talked about, then you must imagine all of the potential timelines that have already become a potential reality based on that energy. So we don't concern necessarily about activities going on during periods of enlightenment unless the enlightenment itself hasn't happened. And we know your next question might be, where is it in terms of that threshold? We are very hopeful because we see so much emotion. And we know that emotion on planet Earth is not being channeled extremely constructively or consciously. But what it's telling us is a connection between the mind and the emotional body is very possible and coming back into being. And that is going to put humans in a very beneficial position to do the things that we are speaking of. Do we think it's possible to totally rid the planet of any karmic influence or darkness? Not necessarily. But how that darkness or karma presents itself is what you have control over, meaning you will always be challenged by something. History is going to come back around because you are here to work with that energy and alchemize it into something far better and new. But it doesn't mean that reptilian human hybrids have to be causing a great deal of suffering on planet Earth. What you must do is go inward and decide what it is each one of you wants for the future of humanity and live that future right now. And in so doing, when the past comes back around, it's going to meet such a completely different vibration that it will be very hard for it to hold on. So the darkness then becomes simple contrast. It becomes something to play with. It becomes a choice between what I prefer and what I do not prefer, as opposed to suffering, violence, and darkness.
You've mentioned on many occasions that this started in an ancient apocalyptic period. In the last conversation we had, we talked about an apocalyptic period that happened about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in our linear time. You're referring to a different apocalyptic period, much older, right?
We are, however, it is actually very similar in scope, but directed in a much compact and smaller area. So this was a radiant energy disruption that took place in the reptilian star system that caused a great genetic decline and dismantling of the union of those beings. And many of them took up residence or home in other locations. But came to Earth because they knew of the precious resource that human DNA was. The codes of their own history and lineage had been seeded within human beings. So to attempt to strengthen themselves on a planet that is not suited well for their survival, they began to tap into human DNA and attempt to use it as a tool or an agent of their survival.
Now, is it even possible to quantify a time when that would have occurred linearly, or was it a completely different dimensional experience?
We are actually speaking of the origins of Earth. So we are going back to the very beginning in which the Earth herself was present but had no life upon her. This is the time in which the seeding actually took place. So, in the midst of that seeding, there were several different events that led reptilians to the planet and orchestrated a great change in the timeline. But this was not only the arrival of reptilians and the cataclysm and their intention. What you have to consider is that their presence in mass on planet Earth became somewhat of a genetic change by its very nature, because the close proximity of any race to another is going to end up in the idea is to end up in an improved situation. But unfortunately, in this case, a more weakened genetic. It's not to say that there were not reptilians already on planet Earth and even beyond that time period, carrying out missions of teaching and healing, for example. And you will see evidence of these beings in very ancient renderings, for example, where they were enlightened and revered. But the ones who are or were causing the most problem took up residence in the inner earth, and many of them are still there. Now, some of them have become more oriented to the surface and have hybridized and have reflected themselves in different families and lineages. But there are some who are not involved in any of this, who are still weakened in their genetic and struggling very much. So it is across the board, we would say, and certainly it is hard for us to make a numerical estimation as to the number of years, because we're working with a more multidimensional and vibrational sense of time than you are. And even before the origins of Earth, many of you were together on similar planets in alternate universes and already planning some of the events that are taking place in the here and now. So we hesitate to actually estimate that, and we also know you're moving in and out of states of linear time, which means there have been periods where Earth has been in a completely different dimension, where time did not exist. And you want to count those as years when, in fact, that time, while very important to history and all that has been created, wasn't necessarily existing in the same form of time that you calculate today.
So you're referring to some ancient reptilians that were more enlightened. Is this a reference to, I know there are many civilizations around the world, some ancient, some that still exist to this day, that refer to having had reptilian gods that they worshipped. And also there's a Naga in India that have been written about, and many sculptures built of them. Were these enlightened beings, or were they the more malevolent kind?
Yes, certainly the more enlightened ones who were revered teachers of various techniques of breath and kundalini and healing, for example. And they were here at the very beginning of time and still remain. So you are witnessing right now how reptilians have become more human in their manifestation. The enlightened teachers that you encounter on your planet today, many of them have a connection and a strong lineage with those who were more enlightened. and vice versa, in terms of those you have identified as causing so many harmful issues on planet Earth. So it is certainly across the board. However, we do want to mention that those who came, the reptilians who came with a sense of love and peace in their hearts, were truly part of an ordained collective that focused on Earth because it was a new planet and would be home to a new race. And there was a strong intention to teach all of the things that had been learned in these various star systems and locations, which are many, simply because the structure that humans were offered was so such an awestruck observation by those off planet, meaning it was new and it was something that was hybridizing on its own in a way of power and strength beyond what many of you realize today. And these light teachers came not to change it or to teach humans how to be, but to observe how it was working so beneficially and offer things that could enhance it. And that's important to note because many would believe that teachings were passed down in very rigid ways that had to be followed in order to ascend or to achieve certain things, when in fact, many of these more benevolent and loving reptilians were in such awe and wonder over the beauty and the power of the human collective that they wanted to understand it better, and they wanted to lend their own perspectives as to how to enhance it beyond, because they had done this themselves in reptilian star systems across the cosmos. Many of these enlightened beings have been focused on achieving the highest vibrational and highest genetic potential state that was possible. And that was done through many of the techniques of breath and meditation and yoga, for example, that are being brought to light today.
You've mentioned that the reptilians are becoming more human-like and that they are a human hybrid. The Naga are depicted in ancient sculptures as being more like a snake. Was that original enlightened race of reptilians more like a snake, and the humanoid aspect was just the hybrid element that came into play?
It was, but keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the way that they appear elsewhere, because any time that a being that exists in another dimension decides to come to a planet that is different, they will go through a complete and total transformation. It is alchemy on all levels. So light begins to alchemize into form to match the vibrations of the planet that they are choosing and the race that they will work with. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to match the way that race appears. If we look at the vision of the snake, ultimately what we are seeing is the manifestation of life force. And this is why the snake has been used in many ancient cultures to represent the Kundalini rising, which is the power of life force moving through the central channel to the top of the crown, and an enlightened soul expressing it in a very conscious way. These beings were masters of Kundalini and creating using life force. But remember, we do say that they have a focus on the mind. That doesn't necessarily make them ill compassionate to other humans. The enlightened mind or the higher mind is a more compassionate type of expression. It does not hold any semblance of separation or ego. But what we are saying is the snake image and those beings, while certainly there are still snakes on planet Earth today, has morphed and somewhat changed. And we see humanoid reptilian hybrids who are a manifestation of these enlightened teachers. They're simply coming back in a new way. We've used this analogy before, and we will use it again. When a seed is planted in the soil, it will become what it was always meant to be. It may not look exactly like the seeds within its lineage, but it will produce similar fruit. And this is what happens on any planet or any star, regardless of the beings who are there. In close proximity, you will harmonize with each other and your genetics will blend and you will become both the strongest parts and the weakest parts of all of that combined energy. And this happens with every other being who has ever come to this planet and beyond. So when we say this, keep in mind that we are speaking of those who are more human in their presentation. We know you understand that there are non-physical entities of light that exist in mass on planet Earth, and many today have the ability to see those and recognize who they are, and others do not.
So in many ancient societies, such as even Atlantis or Egypt, the serpent symbology is used. Many of the pharaohs, for example, like Akhenaten, who we've spoken about in previous conversations, had a snake symbology on their headdress. Nefertiti, same thing. Is this a some sort of a connection or a reflection? Because Akhenaten in particular was focused very much on the one true God, as we've discussed before. What's the connection there? Are they somehow connected to this reptilian race that was more enlightened, or what was that?
Not necessarily. And we want to point out that while the original reptilians, those who were light teachers, took the image of the snake, it is not exclusive to this race, meaning there were others that appeared also in this form or in a semi form. But when we see the image of the snake, we must always refer to the common thread amongst these teachers and beings, which was a focus on life force rising or Kundalini. And the one true God is an expression of or experience of that state of orgasmic bliss. If we want to connect to the God within us, we must have the ability to work with all of the energy we have been offered. And that was one of the beliefs of Akhenaten and many others in that time. It was creation using all of the senses and all of the energy distributed throughout the body, as opposed to the focus on something else outside, or the mind having to put to effort some activity. So when you see the Kundalini today in the image of the snake, it has been expressed for many different purposes and has been taken out of context as well. We know, of course, even in medicine and healing practices today, you can see the image of the snake. And if we take this back to its origins, we are looking at the power of the energy to overcome and heal any physical bodily restriction. But it is taken today to seem something quite different. And we could go on, of course, because throughout history, there are so many examples of how this symbol has been representative of these things or a degradation of them, we believe, as well.
Now, in a lot of the ancient gods and goddesses and so on, there's also, and even in Egyptian pharaohs, for example, and even in the modern day United States, there's the use of the eagle or some sort of a bird-like figure. And even in ancient Indian teachings, there were gods who apparently were more bird-like and were very aggressive and warlike individuals. And there are some stories of this Garuda or bird type of god that was constantly warring with a serpent god or a group of people. What is the story there? Was one malevolent and the other benevolent, or what was the dynamic behind that relationship?
Well, remember, this has changed greatly dependent upon the timeline that you are in. So to say it is representative of one story in every account wouldn't take into consideration that these images have been taken and used for completely different things. However, when you are referring to the bird beings, we relate to the Anunnaki. And again, have to caveat that the Anunnaki as a race are not all malevolent. In fact, very enlightened and benevolent Anunnaki existed on the earth in various forms. However, the war between the two has a great deal to do with a timeline that the Anunnaki are well known for, which is focused on physical resource and coming to planet Earth to harvest that resource and to use it for their own benefit. Because if human souls, those who were not hybrids, who were not revered as such, were to learn how to raise the Kundalini, they would not have been available to such physical tasks, nor separation or manipulation in the way that many of these Anunnaki desired. And there were various religions actually formed around these different viewpoints having to do with praying perhaps to the land or to the muscle or to the body as opposed to what exists within and all around it. This even goes beyond the time period of Anunnaki Akhenaten, for example. So keep in mind that the war between the two is always representing a common thread of division between physical and non-physical, between body and spirit, between a focus of work versus a focus of connection, unification versus singularity or hierarchy. And it wasn't necessarily meant to appear this way because remember, some of the Anunnaki were very revered ancient masters and light teachers. So for those Anunnaki to come and attempt to fool humans into doing something for them as opposed to the greater good, they had to also appear themselves as if they were these benevolent gods.
Okay, so just to clarify, so Garuda, as in the ancient Indian myths, was referencing an Anunnaki being then.
Correct.
Okay. And the serpents they were fighting against, were they the reptilian, more enlightened race, or just some other group? Or is it just an illustration, as you said? Oh, purely just an illustration of those two forces.
It is an illustration of those two forces, but certainly there were differences of opinion expressing uniquely in different timelines between these two belief systems and focus of being. In other words, the more enlightened reptilians and those who were focused on Kundalini believed in the evolution of spirit and the ascension of the one true God within each soul, where the other was determined to somehow diminish that or hide it because it would motivate those who could tap into it to also become gods themselves.
So what does it mean when we see, such as in the case of King Tutankhamun's headdress, where he's got both the eagle or the bird and the serpent at the same time?
What we are seeing here is a desire for unity and the, we'll say, resolution of all of that energy. And this is what he often stood for, because it is important for those who are in power to hold no judgment or to see the good within the bad, meaning everything has God existent within it. And if we are able to tap into the energy of that God and direct it towards the highest and most reverent possibilities, we will all benefit. To have the images of all of those is to assume that you are not necessarily above how they manifest, but open to speaking with, unifying, and using all of the various aspects of it positively. In other words, this was somewhat of a peace position, or a way of extending peace among all civilizations for a ruler who ultimately wanted to achieve that in his lifetime.
Now, there are a lot of symbolism in various seals that are used by world nations, including the United States as an example, that have this symbology embedded in them. For example, even in South America, there are depictions of eagle or Garuda type bird beings from ancient times that have a snake in its mouth or in its claws. In the United States dollar, for example, we use the eagle, and there's a ribbon that is going through its claws, which is sort of a stylized version of the serpent that you see in many other symbology that's a bit more literal. And America means feathered serpent. So, was there an intentional reason behind the naming and these illustrations, even in modern times, in the United States, for example, but also applies to many other countries? Or what was the reasoning behind that?
So several different reasons here, and keep in mind that any ancient symbology is a powerful symbol on its own, meaning all of the history of it exists within its vision. So if we are using something like this, we may be attempting to activate it as a sigil, or encode it with an intention that can actually destruct the original intention that it was actually for. That leans into many of the ceremonies that we have been speaking of previously, using certain symbols and words and ceremonies from the past, and calling in these assumed to be very powerful gods, either degrading their energy such that those who would tap into it could use it for benefit, or heightening it in some very obvious way. Now, keep in mind that the very creation of a physical dollar has its foothold in this reptilian consciousness. So if we are looking back at the very beginning of time, you would see a certain level of exchange of goods and services, and especially those in various tribes taking on their original soul's destiny to contribute in a very unique and powerful way. But to put something material in its place is to take away a soul's sovereignty, because if the currency doesn't exist within us, if the energy isn't as valuable as something tangible in the physical world, then all of a sudden we become lost. And the symbology that you see in many of these occasions, it is telling the story of that. To have a bird-like image carrying a snake within its claws is to show the dominance and even the destruction of a thought school that was so powerful in early days, that those in power know would take away their ability to harness this power and this energy. The physical dollar is a true manifestation of that. So across the board throughout history, what you're seeing is a reminder of, and even the vibration of, the combined understanding of those who are using it and putting it in a certain format that matches their intentions.
Okay, let me just string a few ideas together that we discussed so I can make sure that I'm on the right track. So the bird beings that we see even modern times as an eagle are representing the Anunnaki, and certainly there's a lot of symbology from ancient times of the Anunnaki being depicted that way. So and it appears, and even in our previous conversation, the Anunnaki are from Nibiru, and they are a very advanced race, 12th dimensional, but they seem to have very advanced technology, but they seem to have a warring sort of tendency. And even this god Garuda that's spoken of in ancient Indian myths was a very warring type of being. So is it fair to say that, for example, the United States using the eagle is sort of representing or carrying forward that idea of being a more aggressive, warlike nation?
Certainly, we agree with what you're saying, but also consider that war is the ultimate form of separation. So, if we are separating the masses through war, what we are doing is we are eroding the godlike power of unification or a sense of love, which was the foundation upon which many of those representing the snake were used to or using on a daily basis. So we agree with what you're saying, but what we're suggesting is that at its very core, it is a symbol of separation, separation through violence, perhaps, or separation through war. But we also want to bring back the explanation of the Anunnaki timeline that we spoke of, where humans were being used to provide a certain level of resource to those in power. And we know many of you associate that timeline with gold, which is one of the very important elements that came to be harvested on planet Earth. When you look at the physical dollar today, there is an illusion, perhaps, that it is meant to be backed by gold, and at times it was. But the whole mentality of this dates back to that timeline, because in order for something to be backed by gold, the gold has to come from somewhere. And often what you are seeing is it is the whole of humanity that is either providing that gold to those that are holding it or are somehow made slaves in order to produce it. So you're seeing here the blending of many themes coming through one image.
So you're saying that's an interesting concept. I never really considered that before, that the gold backing of the US dollar originally until 1971 was an illusion or an illustration carrying back to ancient times of how the Anunnaki used humans to mine for gold.
Correct.
And so I have some understanding of what they were mining the gold for. And certainly there are some spiritual implications for gold, but what was their purpose behind it?
Mainly what we have observed in Anunnaki beings is that gold is not necessarily of material value so much as it is to support life force. So those in many ancient star systems have used gold and the property of gold in many different forms. It has manifested as a part of their own beingness. It is manifested as a part of a planet or a star system, and it has been the alchemized energy utilized to create other things. In other words, it has been of great value because it is able to restore and amplify the energy field. It is able to be utilized to actually accelerate vibration and time travel. It has been used as a agent and modality for teleconnecting and accessing the Akashic records, and also understanding how to work with the resonance of heart, because gold itself is a contributor to connection and resonance. And of course, this resonance and connection, it can be a powerful thing to maneuver if you know what you're doing. Gold itself, though, on planet Earth has become something quite different than it was used for in those times.
Now, the author Zecharia Sitchin wrote a lot of books about the Anunnaki, and he interpreted his translations to suggest that the Anunnaki had destroyed their atmosphere, and so they were coming here to use gold as a means of dispersing in their atmosphere. So is that true, or was that just a misinterpretation?
We agree with what he's saying, but we want you to think about your own Earth's atmosphere and how every living thing is a part of it. So the prana of nature, the inhale and the exhale of every human is contributing to a field that you are all working within. And if a planet is no longer able to hold or carry its energy field, what better way to heal or assimilate it than to first strengthen the beings upon it, so such that the field itself can be generated from those beings. So what we observe as this history is perhaps a bit different. It may seem to be a technological or an advanced technological type of element, but it is a natural basis of raising life force and connecting those who are in separation. So if we use it in this way, what we will find is we will enhance anything that we come in contact with, and we can even stabilize an entire planet.
Now, for human beings to use gold today, in what form is it optimal? Just regular gold or colloidal gold, or does it have to be in an like an ORMUS state gold, like white powder gold?
We prefer the powder state, and this is why. The powder state is more resonant with what those in ancient times used, and it is more able to be utilized efficiently by the body than other forms that have been perhaps processed. And there are many different benefits today. Yet what we do want you to remember is you're in an environment that has caused a great deal of destruction. So using gold on a regular basis is first going to support your body's ability to move into a higher dimension. And this has many benefits. We're speaking about the vibration, meaning you have just accelerated your vibration to such a degree that you are stepping into a new dimension, and also has the ability to change the resonance of heart, which of and by itself is a huge benefit as well, connecting you to other beings who are very similar in nature to yourself. But in a higher dimension, in a higher vibration, your body begins to work completely differently. So anything that is of a lower vibration now has to be removed or somehow is displaced. And that's what we love about gold is many of you are going to great lengths to detoxify. And we see you using herbal remedies, for example, in various processes. And we agree that these are working well in many cases. But what gold does is it brings in a vibration that easily displaces what is lower than it. And this can be like a magnet that is clearing your field of things that have not even been recognized yet by humanity that are causing a great deal of disturbance. But the power of powder gold is actually in the connection between the heart and the mind, meaning you may begin to have very astral experiences, seeing on a higher plane of reality, and bringing all of those visions and all of that information with you into your physical reality, being able to integrate it easily and change it in a very calm, we'll say, and peaceful way. It does have this advantage as well, and this is why many revered it in very difficult experiences, like a cataclysm that perhaps the Anunnaki would have experienced. There would be a lot of stress and a great deal of fear, and that would contribute to the timeline because we know that when we are in fear, we are enhancing any timeline of fear simply because we are a vibrational match to it. But using a powder gold, an alchemized powder gold, for example, works on the mind and the heart in such a way that it brings in compassion. It brings in a sense of stability where we do not have to default to our emotions and allow them to override what we now know is possible, in other words. So ultimately, it's a shift in consciousness. And again, we'll use an example that we brought into the previous transmission. A bandwidth of consciousness is essentially a measurement of available information. So we are going for the most expansive bandwidth of consciousness that we are able to achieve in the form that we've chosen. Because when we achieve it, we have insights to things that others do not, or we're able to access information that others do not.
Well, white powdered gold being an alchemical substance for being prepared by somebody who's performing the actual task to prepare it is often made from sea salt, for example, and other substances, and doesn't necessarily use gold itself. But is that still producing the same gold that you're referring to?
When you're looking at gold, what you're actually looking at is a combined vibration of the elemental properties that have formed it. And when you are looking at the ORMUS that you are speaking of, that is made from sea salt, for example, and various elements, it is very similar in nature. Through the intention of the alchemist, there is a merging of valuable energies that are going to become something of greater use. And so this is why we equate it to the value of gold, for example. And certainly it is not to say that taking a form of liquid gold that is colloidal is negative in nature. What we do concern about, however, is a heating process or electromagnetic fields that often weaken its potency. So in an alchemy situation, you often have someone enlightened enough to know that those things should never come in contact with the result. And as such, it is a more pure manifestation of what the body requires.
Well, you mentioned the intention of the alchemist. Considering if you were to purchase white powdered gold from an alchemist who we don't know, doesn't the intention or state of being of the alchemist influence? Because rather than dealing with colloidal gold, we're dealing with an alchemical product which is absorbing the spiritual potential and intention of the individual and the environment that it's made in, right?
Certainly it will. The alchemist is of utmost importance because who they are, what their process is, what their intentions are going to become a part of that manifestation. And we know that seems fearful to some because why would you want to include any vibration of the one who is creating something if it is not the highest possible? And this is why we think many of you notice such huge variations in experiences when you move between one brand of powder gold to another, because what you're actually experiencing and tapping into is that difference in individuals. But also keep in mind that a colloidal gold, it goes through a manufacturing process oftentimes, and there are many hands that touch the bottle. So it is no different, actually, other than the fact that those who are involved in the process may not be as intentional, but their energy nonetheless is a part of it. And we could expand this out to everything that you come in contact with. The ancient alchemists went through such a lengthy process of preparation themselves before they would ever create something through their alchemy that there was no concern of any distortion. But we know today on planet Earth that is a quite different reality.
So how do you know what to choose if you're going to obtain white powder gold from somebody? And how do you know if it's actually producing a positive result versus any harm? Is it even possible for it to produce harm?
Well, there are many ways to discern. And of course, there are considerations of harm, but we don't see them as extremely negligent. In other words, with everything that you are considering on planet Earth today, like GMO foods and toxified air and water, if we look at the realm of alchemy and powder gold, we see very little malevolence there compared to all of the things you're interfacing with on a daily basis. Yet, we know each of you are individuals. And so discerning is going to require you to not only use whatever is uniquely attuned to your own intuition, but also a keen eye and some observation of the alchemists themselves. How is it that they present themselves as a part of the product? What is their lineage and training in this? And especially who has used it before and how long have they been doing this? Because we think the more experienced alchemists are actually being changed by the alchemy itself, meaning those who are doing the process receive the benefit of becoming more enlightened, even though they might not be physically ingesting the product. And this we see across the board in many different situations. So we don't concern that you would be ultimately harmed, although we can say that if you are a very enlightened soul and the alchemist you choose has a lesser level of enlightenment, it may not be such a perfect match, or the potency of the product may not do its good work in a way that you expect.
And does quantity matter? Picking more produces a better result?
This is an individual decision, not in every situation, because if the powder gold is going to enhance our telepathy and our consciousness, for example, depending on where that is at before we begin ingesting it, there may be periods of transition or integration that we have to go through. Remember, anything that is shifting consciousness is apt to change our reality just as quickly. And it can be uncomfortable, we know, at times to go through these processes. So it will be important for each individual to judge their experiences and to stay in the present moment with how they are feeling, and to time appropriately their doses to what they are attempting to achieve. For us, we believe it's always important when you make these choices to ingest anything to have a clear intention on what you are attempting to achieve, because it can take you in many directions. So whatever your intention is something that you're able to measure against on a daily basis, and then decide as to how much more, how much little or less you should be ingesting.
So going back to earlier conversation, were the Anunnaki using white powdered gold then? Were they harvesting white powdered gold, or were they harvesting real gold?
This was more a material manifestation of the element gold and the property which is existent within your earth.
And so their goal wasn't for enlightenment. They were using it for other reasons.
Not necessarily for enlightenment, but to create a field.
Okay. Now, in many people who have researched the subject area and in ancient mythology, the various Greek gods, Roman gods such as Zeus and Thor and so on, Zeus, let's say, as an example, is represented by the eagle. And so are the Greek gods more related to the Anunnaki? Are they referencing the Anunnaki race?
Some of them are, because these gods, while they seem very mystical and unearthly, are actually hybrids as well. And some of them existed in a more human and physical form, and others were experienced on ships, for example. So we do see some Anunnaki lineage referring to what you are speaking to, but not in every circumstance. In other words, this time period represents so many different cosmic orientations. It was a period of time in which the veil was very thin, and those on Earth were communicating with beings beyond who would come to the earth for a period of time or would exist in the astral but yet appear to those who were still on earth and take certain characteristics.
And there's also some stories about the sea peoples who conquered Egypt and other parts of the world, and some suggestions that the sea peoples who apparently used a snake symbolism were coming from an Atlantean civilization. Is that true?
This is true. The Atlanteans, many of them, especially near and around the fall, took a journey to pilgrimage to other areas of the earth and along the way transformed themselves. But we want to go into the period just before and during the fall of Atlantis that many speak of, because decisions were made at this time for souls to go in multiple directions and reincarnate in different forms. In today's world, you speak of a soul walk in. Sometimes a human believes that they are completely renewed because an aspect of their soul or a completely different soul piece has walked in and taken over their psyche and their physicality and their spirit. And while this is possible in varying degrees, what happened in Atlantis was an immediate desire for those who were there to reincarnate and come back as something else. And some of them decided to become what you're calling the sea hybrids. Many of them still exist today. We often refer to the dolphin matrix as the Atlantean hybrids, for example. So certainly the image of the snake is showing the relationship to a more enlightened civilization where similar principles were practiced. Raising the Kundalini, understanding its power and the connection to Prime Creator. These images were utilized to recognize each other as well, meaning Anunnaki, meaning Atlanteans had taken so many different forms that to recognize each other in the new locations and timelines that they had chosen would use this symbology.
So this was around the time of the fall of Atlantis, around 12,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago. There's not a lot of information about the origins of Atlantis, but some theories state that it was a 50,000-year-old civilization that collapsed about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Some go into the hundreds of thousands of years. And I know it's a different dimension that we're dealing with, that in the height of Atlantis, but is there any way to quantify that, or was it a different timeline that we can't really quite comprehend?
The origins of Atlantis began in Sirius. So many of the Syrians of the time had left that star system and were called to come to Earth to create a model of it on a new planet. There had been so much advancement and there was so much excitement about the varying practices and technologies and what was being created that it was meant to be shared, not only here on Earth, but also on other star systems. So the Atlantean concepts and Atlantean civilization that many of you study today did not only exist on Earth, it has existed in different forms throughout the cosmos. So if we date back that 50,000 linear years, for example, we're not necessarily seeing a physical civilization that was completely formed on Earth just yet. What we're seeing more is a movement towards the Earth with all of these techniques and teachings from a group of enlightened Syrians who were very excited to become earthly.
And so that's why we see a lot of the Syrian symbology around the world. For example, the pyramids in Egypt are apparently lined up as the stars of Sirius. And so, in the very beginnings of Atlantis on Earth, and there's not a lot of information, but there are some writings of a very enlightened group of people who were leading Atlantis, and who went by the name of Naacal. At least that's the information we have. Did these beings actually exist? And were they at the beginning of Atlantis?
Syrian elders, yes, who had come to not oversee in a governmental fashion necessarily, but to guide and to mentor those who would not only come from Sirius, but come from different directions on the earth to be a part of something so miraculous and exciting. Now, these beings were ageless and timeless. So many of them existed from the very beginning of that civilization and remained throughout its time all the way up until the fall, which we know is something very foreign to those on planet Earth today who understand that birth and death happen within a certain age range. But these souls had been focused for such a long period of time on losing resistance to the body or to any manifestation of it that they had become, we'll say, in a self-generating way, renewed through their breath. And this was one of the teachings of the early civilization Atlantis, was to use the breath as an agent of rejuvenation such that the body could become the most heightened technology possible. Many of these beings after the fall continued into civilizations like Egypt, for example, and are recognized as some of the leaders and teachers there.
So Naacal were from Sirius, and so I assume that's an entirely different group than the Naga we discussed earlier, who were an enlightened race of reptilian beings.
Yes,
Correct?
correct.
Okay. So if the Sea Peoples were descendants of Atlantis and they use the snake symbology, where does that all mix in if they're using a symbology that represents this reptilian race?
Those that were present at the time were not yet necessarily in contact with the reptilians who were teaching these practices of Kundalini, but because of their telepathic abilities and nature, were tuning in to that energy. And it's hard to imagine we know that you could be taught something from beyond the veil, because so many of you today are taking classes and studying from teachers, and there is a direct relationship between what you learn in a book and what you apply in your physical lives. But in many of these civilizations, that was not necessarily the case. These beings were highly advanced and able to tune in not only to information in the Akashic records, but things that were happening elsewhere. So conversations were had, information was shared, practices were shared, and there was a certain reverence and honoring of those in other dimensions and civilizations that were carrying out similar practices to the Syrians, because the Syrians are a very loving collective. They accept every race for their differences and cherish those differences. So what they want is not necessarily a division between teachings or religions. What they want is to blend them all and to show thanks and appreciation for those who are sharing things that are slightly different than their own, and finding some commonality between them all to the benefit of those they are guiding.
Now, there are a lot of discoveries of remains of ancient peoples now, um, not as far back as we're talking right now, but many of them are shown to be Caucasian with blue eyes, red hair, for example. What did the Syrians have a physical form we'd recognize today, or more humanoid, or was it different?
Some of the original ones were far more humanoid, although the blue tint of the eye is a common characteristic, and this is why. There's somewhat of a crystalline vibration that many of these original elders carried. And it was something that was achieved over many, many lifetimes of working not only with the breath, but with the DNA. And the eye itself, the iris and the retina of the eye was completely different than the one that you're working with today. And that's why we can officially call these beings seers. They were not exclusively using the third eye or the inner eye to see and understand energy, but they were able to translate it very deliberately and directly through a manifestation of a very advanced type of eyesight. But certainly the white skin and the color of hair is a lineage that dates back to Sirius, but not exclusively. We do even see some Anunnaki, for example, holding those certain characteristics. So there are dominant genetics that will manifest on planet Earth in a lighter and brighter skin, and it has nothing to do with the hue or the physicality of the skin itself. It is more a translation of energy. And this is not to assume that skin of a darker color is a lower vibration. It was just the way that many of these hybrids transitioned and alchemized onto a planet that even at this time was quite different than the one that you're standing on today. And of course, even back in these days, there were beings coming in from planets beyond Sirius, such as Lyra, for example, and even Andromeda. And the different vibrations that they brought would bring different colors of hair and skin into being. So we agree that there is a Syrian connection here. We're simply allowing for the deviation from that in others, which is certainly the case.
Well, today we have a lot of different races on Earth, different skin colors and eye colors and so on. Did that exist in the original seeding of Earth, or did those the same races we see today, in addition to these other ones that you're mentioning, or was it a Caucasian race originally?
So, the intention of seeding a human DNA genetic in multiple races is to manifest and hybridize a race of diversity. And that's ultimately what you are seeing today. So we speak so much about the degradation of the DNA, but this is where we want to acknowledge its beauty, because in every occasion of difference in skin color or eye color or hair, what you are seeing is a representation of your cosmic families in real time. But if we go back to the very beginning of time and the entry of these hybrids, we do see a dominant propensity towards that in almost elusive, transparent color of the skin. Keep in mind that some of the original humans were still hybrids. So what you call human today is very different from what was human at the beginning of time. These beginning, these original hybrids that were moving into a more human form took on the likeness and the characteristics dominantly of the beings who were there. And eventually that began to change. And even the hybrids who came to the planet changed themselves. So it's easy to think that a Pleiadian comes to planet Earth and moves through a portal and manifests in a specific form slightly different than humans and stays in that form throughout its period of time on the Earth. But that isn't necessarily the case, because these are multidimensional beings who hold that multidimensionality on a physical planet, meaning they have a greater propensity to change and to shapeshift beyond what humans do in a very quick fashion.
So where did all of the racist philosophies and ideas that seem to be in many ways ancestral. They have repeated throughout history and probably ancient history, I'm not sure, but still perpetuate to this day. It seems to switch from race to race to race, but at the moment, the racism is against Caucasian people, but at other times it has been different groups of people. So, what's the origin of that idea?
Well, you believe there is an origins in history that will make sense. And what we actually see is in every occasion, this has been seeded. So if we go back to our discussion about the physical dollar and how its very premise is to create a hierarchy and a separation and a weakening of a collective race, many other timelines and intentions exist to keep this level of separation and what you called war alive. And so it isn't one being that we can blame. However, we do see that in some civilizations, certain colors of beings were revered and represented hybrids or cosmic families. So to have a specific color skin, for example, was to associate with a Syrian, or to have a specific color hair or eyes was to associate with an Andromedan. And in and of itself, a human being is working with a certain amount of ego and sense of judgment. And unfortunately, this has been suppressed within humans, this idea of ego, which is not an outer reflection of who you are. It's meant to be an extension of the love that you are able to find within the self. So everything here on planet Earth, unfortunately, has been taken out of context of the norm and what it was meant to be. And today, what you're experiencing is simply another iteration of these timelines returning again and causing humans great suffering to somehow point fingers and create war and separation, which is ultimately weakening all of you.
Let me put in context our discussion from a previous time when we talked about the fallen angels and how they were in very ancient times, and today we lump them all together as Satan or Satanism. And what, if it's even possible to explain, where in the timeline does that event occur? Because we just talked about Atlanteans and Syrians and all of these people going back to tens of thousands of years and beyond. Did the fallen angels happen at the very beginning of the Earth's creation, or was it in one of these other storylines?
Well, you are assuming that there is only one time period in which fallen angels were present, but we have seen fallen angels as a part of your history across the board, meaning from the origins to where you stand today. But essentially, these fallen angels are intergalactic souls who are here to cause trouble or have an agenda that is supporting something about the Earth's experience that isn't taking it in the most beneficial direction. But perhaps what you're asking us is, when was the first organization of all of these beings as one focused upon to harness its energy? And while we want to give you a date, we do see several different ancient timelines and experiences where this took place in a slightly different way. You've asked us about Akhenaten, for example, and especially in this time, what we have noticed is intergalactic beings, ETs, that had a specific show of power were prayed to and focused on for those on planet Earth who were suffering and wanting to achieve things. And this was taken advantage of and became sort of a twisted religion in which those who were weakened in their power were giving it away readily and easily through ceremony and sacred words to those who were glad to take it. And this has gone on in many different iterations and generations. And in fact, even today, We think it still exists. What you call Satanism is a conglomeration of many people who actually believe that they are the gods that you should be praying to. And as such, are putting themselves in those positions. So it isn't just the actual fallen angels that are important to acknowledge as a part of this Satanist collective, but the humans who have actually become an extension of them in their own physical way, and are somehow siphoning the power of that to benefit themselves.
So the fallen angels weren't Anunnaki or Syrian or any of the races we've discussed so far. They're
Well,
completely
there are
different.
many who refer to the Anunnaki as fallen angels, certainly. So if we are going back in time, we agree that this is a very prominent one of focus, because there are periods where the Anunnaki came and had a certain agenda in mind that caused destruction to the planet and to humans. But beyond that, we want to make the point that this theme, this common theme, it still exists today. It is just perhaps evolved into something completely different.
When you say it exists today, and there are many instances where fallen angels occurred, so you're saying there was only not one group of fallen angels. It's just happened throughout time, and there are still fallen angels coming today.
Malevolent beings are teaching others in the way of siphoning energy, whether it's coming from the Kabbalah, as we have mentioned previously, or there are channeled encounters with those who are deemed powerful that are actually dark and teaching ceremonies and other techniques to harness that energy. Certainly, that still goes on today.
And how do we counteract those efforts, or so that we can live more in alignment and not be affected by those efforts?
Well, anything that you believe is more powerful than you is robbing you of power. So the only solution is to not give your power away to things that you know are causing problems for yourself or for humanity. There is a phrase that many of you use on planet Earth today about taking back your power, but in and of itself, this phrase is often leading people down the path of giving it away because it is a forceful type of representation in the world where boundaries are set and there is separation and there is a reclaimed ego. But that is not at all the way. The more that you are able to unify and live in a state of self love, the less you will have to worry about what's going on beyond that because you are supporting everything that takes place in a collective way, meaning you are either giving your energy away to something that will take it and use it to your detriment, or you are replenishing and channeling it towards something very good in your life. So we might say that the foundation of any change on a global scale when it comes to Satanism or fallen angels is to utilize all of your energy and power to create a life that brings yourself and others joy. And when you do, they are not receiving your power and are no longer powerful in the sense that they have always been.
Well, the idea of creating a life that brings joy, I think everybody has a different concept of what that is, right? And we discussed before when an individual is in alignment with their soul's intention for being here, whatever resources they need are provided. So whether it's money or people or other things, so that they can live that fulfilling life. But a lot of people, I think, in society today are following a path that may not be in proper alignment. Last time we talked about the 369 and utilizing that as a means of getting back into alignment. So how does somebody, let's say right now, especially in the world today and in this decade ahead, that's probably going to be a little bit difficult, people who are struggling and in various different ways, I'm sure financially to a great extent, how do they get into a state of joy in their life, especially if they feel like the resources aren't available for them to create that?
To truly manifest your soul's highest joy and to be in alignment with a plan that is curated to do this, you must understand and see clearly all of the things that are standing in its way. And most of these things have been put in the way by choice, not consciously, but unconsciously. So you're asking us about the 369 equation or geometry or pattern. And to us, from a purely technological standpoint, the 369 creates an unbroken channel of energy to the universe, a higher connection through which consciousness must expand. And if that is true, and you're using any type of meditative practice, what you're going to begin to experience is an expansion of that consciousness. And the first thing that a soul experiences when their consciousness expands are all of the things that are unnaturally accepted by them, yet diminishes their power. So it can be defeating at first, we know, to have this experience of awakened consciousness, but you must take note and be mindful that you are only at the very beginning stages of walking into a new perspective of what brings you joy and how to achieve it than you have had your entire life. But let's talk speak to the 369 for a moment, since you've injected it in the conversation, because essentially what you are seeing in these numbers is a sacred geometric organization. It's symmetry, and it is also synchronicity. So any form of breath work, or we'll say visualization of geometries with this pattern, is going to bring more of that into your life, meaning what you do and what you intuit are going to have logical connections, which we know is not typically the case on planet Earth today. Souls have a spiritual side and they have a physical side, and they're very separate of each other. There are meditations being had and information being garnered and brought in, and then a soul is going into another timeline and living its life in a completely opposite way. So that fusion of the two is possible when geometries come into symmetry. Everything in our life tends to fit together, and we make an effort to see where it connects. But in addition to this, the synchronicity of life, which is the ultimate manifestation of higher consciousness, comes into being. And this is where many who are striving for messages from their guides, for example, will fall to their knees in grace, because they will begin to see that the guidance exists all around them. And ultimately, this is for the highest and best potentials to ground into your experience. They don't come automatically with a 369 environment or connection. They must be chosen by you and followed through by you. But life becomes easier because what you seeded within your divine plan and what exists within your soul essence truly must be met by everything in the outer world to create it as such. It is just that many of you are not seeing the availability of those options in front of you, nor have the reminder of how important they are within you. So we hope that answers your question.
Yes, I'd like to conclude by just sort of clarifying the actual mathematics, if it's even relevant, and or numerology of the structure of the 369, because it seems a little bit intangible. I mean, is it enough for us to put a flower of life on the wall in our house? Or when we're talking about 369, the actual mathematics of it, are we talking about the 369 magic square that's sort of a checkerboard shape with all the numbers in every row and column and diagonals adding up to 369, 3 plus 6 plus 9, for example, which ends up equaling 9? Or rather, 6 plus 3 is 9, plus 9 is 18, which is 9, right? So you can create a magic square where every row, column, and diagonal ends up being 9. Is that the mechanical element of it? Do we use that, or do we just simply use an artistic representation like the flower of life?
Well, making it so mechanical and mind driven is not the point, even though we know throughout history there have been those that have translated these numbers into various formats to use in their own practices. Having the flower of life image in your home, for example, we believe is very beneficial because what you do not see is that that pattern moves through your space to infinity. So it is a very powerful pattern that by and of itself will begin to generate energy differently within your space. And because of that, it must affect you. But interaction with it deliberately actually strengthens that potential. So gazing upon it, for example, begins to have an impact on your own energy field and the inner connection that you're making to the outer. It is not of and by itself going to change your reality because keep in mind, you're living in a very dense period of time where physical steps are always going to be required. But deep within you, that 369 pattern exists. It is evidenced in a pyramid, for example, and those that would step into the pyramid would find complete alignment and resonance with the universe and walk out a changed person. You have the ability to do the same within yourself. If you are practicing a tantric breath, for example, raising the kundalini from the powerhouse centers in the sacral and root and channeling that upward, what you will find is you will resonate in this pattern yourself. So we don't think it's necessarily difficult. And we think there's also some room and space for you to create your own practice around it. Because if we look at the enlightened masters of ancient periods, they were using that 369 pattern in their own divination or in their own way to create something. So we say become creative with it. But quite simply, to experience its power, you must start within and utilize the breath to channel that energy upward. And as a sacred geometric being at heart, you will also find that harmony.
Okay, I don't want to get into the subject too far, but just to touch on it, and we'll continue this conversation in the future. But you mentioned being inside of a pyramid has the same frequency as 369. In ancient times, especially in India, they used a form of architecture that's referred to as Vastu Shastra. Was this architectural form to create that 369 frequency in a home environment?
This is one of the manifestations we are speaking of that we believe is coming back to your planet again in the future. We're taking these calculations or these universal mathematic configurations and putting them into a very creative outlet of some kind can have immediate and incredible benefits.
Okay. Well, that's good for today. We've gone a little over a couple of hours, so thank you. Thank you, Micheila. And thank you all for joining us again for another Channeled Revelations. And we will be back in another week with a podcast and then Channeled Revelations every other 2 weeks. So we'll stick with that schedule for a little while. And we'll see you next time.